All right, here we are, lecture number 2, which I'm going to upload in 4 parts. One dealing with the Washington administration, the second dealing with the Adams administration, the third, the Jefferson administration, and the fourth, the Madison administration, which encompasses also the War of 1812. That will move us all the way through the end of chapter 8 before our second test. Remember, this lecture is going to be covered on that second test, which I will upload to you not long after I post the videos. There will be no objective portion to that test because you will be answering the objective portion by sending in your responses to the questions that I'm asking at the end of the lectures. Those will all add up to be the objective portion of the exam. The essays will require you to do the same thing that you did on the first test. You will have a choice of 2 essays to write on. You will, however, this time around, type up your essays and email them to me. They can only be a single page long, which of course allows you to say a lot more than you can writing it out in longhand under the pressure of time. These will be open book essays. So you can consult the notes, you consult the video lectures, you can consult your book in order to write a good essay. Of course, I will expect grammar, spelling, punctuation to be correct. So use your spell check, use your grammar check on the computer, and I will have a higher bar for accuracy because you are taking an open book test. So the standard for performance here is going to go up because the complexity of what you're being asked to do is being simplified since you are going to have up to a week to give me your answers. There has been a question that's been asked by some of your fellow students about how quickly I want answers to the questions at the end of each video lecture, and the answer is I want you to see these video lectures within the week after they are posted, so you have until the next lecture to watch those videos and send in your answers, okay? I won't hold everybody hard and fast to that on the first one, but from this point forward, that will be our standard, okay? So always feel free to ask questions. I know that this is kind of strange and new to all of us. I'm going to be doing some experimentation with this lecture, so I'm going to put this up as a podcast in case you have a hard time watching the video or you just don't like watching the video. I'm also going to, again, try to incorporate some pictures. We'll see how that works. It's very time consuming, so I don't know that I'll be able to do it for every single lecture or every single part of every lecture. I'm going to make the attempt to make this a little bit more than just a talking head. All right. So again, remember you can ask questions by email. Let's stay in contact with each other since we're not getting to see each other once a week. Take care of yourselves. That's all important, and we will go forward from here. So we're going to start now part 1 of our second lecture, and that's going to deal with the immediate aftermath of the constitutional ratification. So we have a brand new constitution. It is a constitution that vastly strengthens the central government, specifies its powers. It now can levy taxes, it can impose tariffs, it can regulate interstate commerce, it can pass laws with the authority to impose its will on the states. But of course, there were all kinds of questions that were going to be asked in this new environment, and those questions were pretty fundamental. Was this new constitution going to work? Was this new constitution going to see one branch of the federal government dominate the other two, the executive branch possibly dominating the judicial and the legislature? Or would it be the legislature dominating the judicial and the executive? Or would the executive and the judicial team up to dominate the legislative. Nobody really knew. This had never been done before. Would the central government really prove more powerful than the state governments? That was the idea, but was it actually going to work in practice? What was the nature of this new presidency going to be? We decided to have a one-man chief executive. Was that going to go sideways very quickly? Again, you were going to have to wait and see. And then there were the fundamental questions that always show up when you have a new administration. And those are questions about policy. What kind of economic policy, diplomatic policy, military policy is this administration going to have? And so all of that remained to be seen. There was, of course, only one choice for the presidency of the United States, and that was George Washington. And he was unanimously elected by the Electoral College. He will be reelected 4 years later in the same fashion, the only person to ever receive the unanimous vote of the Electoral College. There have been a couple of presidents who've come close, but nobody's actually achieved that since Washington, and it's unlikely that anyone ever will. So if you have a system where the person who gets the most electoral votes becomes president, and the person who gets the second most electoral votes becomes vice president, and Washington got all the votes the first time, well, you have to have a second ballot to determine who the vice president is going to be, and John Adams of Massachusetts was selected. So we have a Southerner, Washington, from Virginia as president. We have a New Englander, Adams from Massachusetts, as vice president. And that kind of sets up a trend that's going to continue for a while, that you're going to have one president from one section and the vice president from another section of the country, kind of creating a little bit of a balance, if you prefer to look at it that way. And so these are the two elected officials. And of course, we have a brand new Congress. That Congress has already gotten very busy. So it had drafted and sent out to the states for ratification the original Bill of Rights, which we remember were ratified. It repasses the Land Ordinance of 1785. It repasses the Northwest Ordinance, so they're now codified under law as part of the new constitutional government. It creates the judiciary as required. The national judiciary is required by the Constitution. And it also creates the departments of the federal government. So we get a Department of State, we get a Department of War, we get a Department of Treasury. And the Constitution laid all of that out and said that the people appointed to those posts must be by the president, nominated by the president, must be approved by the Senate. And of course, that was going to happen fairly easily. And so Washington had the great benefit of being able to select from some very talented men who had played critical roles in the American Revolution. So as his Secretary of the Treasury, he selected Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. Jefferson, remember, is the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. He had been governor of Virginia in the latter part of the Revolutionary War, and then he had gone on to become the United States ambassador to France. And so he was not at the Constitutional Convention. This is something a lot of people often forget. Jefferson wasn't part of that body that crafted the Constitution. He was in Paris at the time, and actually kind of reluctant to leave Paris to come back to the United States, but Washington prevailed upon him and he agreed, so he comes back and he becomes the Secretary of State. As Secretary of War, Washington selected Henry Knox. Henry Knox, who had commanded the artillery of the Continental Army throughout the war. Henry Knox, the guy who drug all those cannon through the snowy wilderness of upstate New York from Fort Ticonderoga so that Washington could drive the British out of Boston in early 1776. He becomes the Secretary of War. And then as Secretary of the Treasury, we get Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton is, of course, from New York City. Although he was not born in America, he was born in the West Indies and came to America as a young teenager. Hamilton had been one of Washington's key aides during a good part of the Revolutionary War. He'd gone on to command one of the most important assaults on the British defenses at Yorktown, and we know that he had played a big role at the Constitutional Convention, where his proposal for an elective monarchy had helped to save the Virginia plan when it was threatened by the New Jersey plan. And So Hamilton is now the Secretary of the Treasury. So this new government gets up, it gets operating. It's a very small government, very small. The administration of our campus at ACC would have is probably larger than the number of personnel who were in that first administration under George Washington. But a couple of very important things happen under Washington's administration very, very early on. First off, Washington sets the proper tone. He's dignified, he's respectful, he's willing to work with the judicial and the legislative branches of government, but he's going to make the presidency a position of real power, real authority, while not making it a position that resembles anything like a dictator or a king. And a symbol of how Washington was going to sort of take a humble approach is his vote for how the chief executive should be addressed. This was actually a question. What are you going to call the president when he's introduced? There were all kinds of proposals, and he shied away from things like Your Highness, Your Excellency, and he put his stamp down on the idea that he simply be called Mr. President. Mr. President, it's a simple job title. It confers nothing about being regal or sovereign or more special than the ordinary citizen. He's just the guy who temporarily has the job. The other thing that Washington does is to create the first presidential cabinet. There's nothing in the Constitution about that. Washington, as president, appoints the people who will run the departments of the federal government created by the Congress, but he, having been a general, was used to having councils of war, bringing all of his generals in with him and getting their advice, sharing his plans, talking things through. And he's going to continue that as president. And of course, he's got brilliant men to work with, Hamilton and Jefferson and Knox. And so he forms them into a close-knit group of advisors that come to be known as the cabinet. And because Washington has a cabinet, every president since has had a cabinet. It's the first thing that people ask when somebody gets elected to the presidency. Who's going to be in your cabinet? Who are going to be your principal advisors? And this highlights the fact that everything that Washington does is establishing a precedent. He's doing it for the first time, and then that's going to become the norm, the expectation for how it's going to be done forever after. And even though this small government is not large in terms of personnel or expenditure, it's getting things done. We've already seen Congress pass several important laws, but take Jefferson's State Department, for example. The official staff of the State Department, if we exclude ambassadors overseas, consisted of Jefferson, 2 clerks, 2 assistant clerks, and 1 part-time translator. So the entire State Department structure in the capital, which originally was New York, and then would become Philadelphia while we were building a new capital city for the new government under the new Constitution. The entire State Department consists of 5.5 people, and even then it was able to conduct not only America's foreign policy, but it also oversaw the first census of the United States, which is required by the Constitution. We're going to take a physical count of the American people and figure out how many of them are in each state, and that is important because that's how you determine representation in the House of Representatives, the lower branch of the Congress, and of course that is also going to play a role in apportioning the electoral votes of the states for the Electoral College and the creation, or rather the election of the president. Now, we have a new government, but the problems are old. And of course, the most pressing problem that the United States faced was an economic problem. The country, in many ways, is created because of economic crisis. And that had led to the Annapolis Convention, that had led to the Philadelphia Convention, and economic problems and taxation had created things like Shays' Rebellion and this sort of thing. And so getting the country's economic house in order was extremely important for the new government. And to do that, Washington turned toward Hamilton, his Secretary of the Treasury, which of course makes a great deal of sense. Hamilton was a very smart fellow, he was sophisticated. He was, remember, a man for whom the phrase, the ends justify the means, was very appropriate, and Hamilton immediately proposed a series of federal actions that would right the economic ship of state. And he laid these out beginning in the January of 1790 and sort of rolled them out over the next couple of years. But the proposals were actually very straightforward. And the first thing he proposed to do was to fully fund the federal debt. The second thing he proposed was that the federal government assume the debts, at least the war debts, of the 13 states. Then he proposed the creation of a national bank, and finally the implementation of a protective tariff. And all of these proposals turned out to be very controversial. There are people who didn't like them for a variety of reasons. They caused a great deal of debate in the Congress. The idea of fully funding the federal debt seems straightforward, but in fact it wasn't. The United States government had a debt of $54 million, and that was the inherited debt, if you will, from the Revolutionary War, Second Continental Congress, and the government under the Articles of Confederation. And a lot of that $54 million was owed to people who had bought government bonds. So the $54 million, $40 million was in the form of bonds that were about to come due and would have to be paid off. And most of you have probably at one time or another gotten a savings bond from a grandparent or something like that. And you know that you do not purchase a savings bond or any kind of treasury bond or government bond at its full value. You pay less. And let's keep it really simple. Let's say you pay half. So you're going to buy a $10 bond, you pay $5 for it. Now, when you buy that bond, essentially what you're doing is giving a loan to the government. You're giving the government $5 today that it can use to do things, and in exchange for that loan, the government is saying that if you keep the bond until it matures in, say, like 10 or 15 years, we are not only going to give you your $5 back, we're going to give you a guaranteed profit of another $5. So I buy the bond for $5, I keep it for 10 years, it matures, and when I cash it in, I get $10. That's why bonds are attractive, because you can do something patriotic, lend some money to the government to meet current needs, and you will not only be sure to get your money back, you have a guaranteed profit, not based on interest rates or anything like that. You know what you're going to get. And in order to finance the Revolutionary War, and in order to finance the government under the Confederation, the U.S. had sold a lot of these bonds. But of course, the problem with these bonds during the Revolutionary War and the period of the Confederation was, first, the economy got worse and worse and worse as time rolled on. The situation of the United States often looked precarious, and if the United States lost the Revolutionary War, if the Congress of the Confederation couldn't hold things together and the country collapsed, then there would be no government to pay off those bonds, and that meant you would never get to cash them in. The money that you had invested in them was gone. The potential profit that you had supposedly been guaranteed was gone. And in that crisis, a lot of people had decided to sell their bonds. And they sold their bonds to speculators. These were people who had cash, who were looking for a deal. They were willing to buy those bonds at a discount. So you bought the bond at $5. They say, well, I can't give you $5, I'll give you $2. You get $2 in your hand now to feed your family or pay your taxes or something like that. It means that I'm assuming the risk. I'm assuming the risk that the government's still going to be around when this bond matures, and I can cash it in and get my investment back and the guaranteed profit. And a lot of people had sold their bonds under these circumstances. When the Continental Army was discharged following the ratification of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the soldiers were paid in bonds. But young men needing to get on with their life couldn't wait for 10 years for these bonds to mature. And so they sold them to speculators. And as a consequence of that, of the 20,000 people who held these bonds, so it's a tiny percentage of the population. You get 2 million people in the United States, only 20,000 of them actually hold these bonds. Only 20% of those were the actual purchasers, the original purchasers of the bonds. So you have a large amount of money that's going to come due very quickly, and you're going to have to pay it to speculators. And there were people in the Congress and in the press who said, well, we shouldn't do that. These people had taken advantage of the soldiers when they were discharged. They'd taken advantage of the good farmer and townsman during the Revolutionary War. And this is a new government. Should we bankrupt it at the very beginning to pay off this debt run up by two governments that no longer exist? And should we absolutely do that to pay the likes of these speculators who have gamed the system? So why not pass a law just obliterating the debt? We're the government. We could do that. Why not pass a law saying we're only going to honor bonds that are held by the original purchasers? We could do that and thus vastly eliminate or reduce the debt. And Hamilton argued in his full funding proposal that was, one, immoral, and then secondly, it was a horrible idea. First off, these bonds are payable to the bearer, and that meant that the original purchaser could sell them if they wanted. They could make a good deal, they could make a bad deal. It was their choice in their circumstances, and so if they had decided to sell them, that was a legal transaction, and the speculators who had bought them had assumed risk. That risk was now going to pay off, and they were standing to make a handsome profit, but there was nothing illegal about that either. And so beyond the fact that this was all legal and beyond the fact that morally you should pay your debts, Hamilton also argued that in the future the government was going to have to sell bonds, and for all kinds of reasons, but perhaps to fund another war with England. Nobody thought England was done with us, and so we're going to fight them again. And as a consequences of that, you had better be able to sell bonds. But if you're going to come in now and say, well, we've decided that we don't want to honor those bonds, or you come in now and you say that, well, we don't like you, so we're not going to pay you, or we're going to pay these people we do like, who would want to buy your bond in the future? And the answer, of course, is probably nobody. And if nobody wants to buy your bonds, you can't raise money selling those bonds, and that's going to be very bad in some future crisis. And that logic prevailed, and Hamilton got full funding through the Congress, and Washington signed it into law. His next proposal is assumption of state war debt by the federal government. Collectively, the states owe $25 million. So their collective debt was almost half of what the national debt was. And what Hamilton proposes is that the federal government take on those state war debts and pay them off. And this would, of course, be a great relief on the budgets of the states. And so why would a state object? Well, there were objections, and the objections came from two places. First off, some states had worked very hard to pay off their debt, and they had suffered great pain in the process of doing that, and other states hadn't. And of course, if the federal government assumes those states' debts, it's going to use federal revenue drawn from the federal treasury to do it, and that means that the states who had not taken care of their business, so to speak, were going to benefit from not having done it, and the states that had taken care of their debt were basically going to be penalized for it. You hear echoes of this argument today when there are political proposals to forgive student debt. And one of the objections to that is, well, is that fair to the people who, worked their way through college, whose parents saved carefully and paid their way or have paid off their debt, so they worked hard, they were responsible, they did the right thing, they took care of their debt, and the people who traveled a different path are now going to benefit using tax dollars that are in part drawn from people who had done the responsible thing, had taken care of the expenses as they went along. And so you have, for the first time, this argument show up in the national debate over whether or not the national government, the federal government, can pick winners and losers. Can it undertake a policy that benefits one group of people at a harm to another group of people? So there was sort of a philosophical component to that argument, but there was also a political component, because a lot of state governments suspected that Hamilton wasn't just being altruistic here. What Hamilton is doing by assuming state debts is he's removing the state's voice in national economic policy, because if the federal government is the only one that holds substantial debt, then the federal government is the only one that has leverage to say, hey, this is what we got to do. If the states don't owe any debt, they're not going to be impacted by those decisions, and therefore they don't really have any leverage. And so there was opposition, but once again, Hamilton was able to make the case. It passes the Congress, and Washington signs it into law. So 2 at-bats, 2 home runs for Alexander Hamilton. Now we come to his third proposal, and that is the creation of a national bank that would be modeled more or less after the National Bank of England. This would be a federal institution that would not be just a single building, although it would have a headquarters in New York, but there would be mints, there would be the ability to coin money, to print paper money. This would be the avenue by which the government sold bonds, collected taxes and tariff revenues. It would be the principal instrument for the government to influence the economy. And Hamilton thought that was a really good idea. There were those who disagreed. A lot of Americans did not interact with banks. In fact, probably most Americans did not interact with banks, and many of them didn't understand banks or finance, and there was something that was sort of suspicious about banks. You know, most people worked and made a living by the sweat of their brow. They grew things, they made things, they dug ditches, they sailed ships, and that sort of thing. Whereas the banker sits in his office with that little green visor pulled down over his head, and he works with pen and paper, and he uses other people's money to make money for himself. And some people consider that to be kind of an immoral way of making a living. There was an even greater fear that a national bank would be manipulated by the moneyed interest in the country, the economic elite of the nation, who were as close to an American aristocracy as you were going to get. They would have the know-how and the connections and the influence to be the managers of the bank, to be the employees of the bank, and they would look out for their own self-interest, even if that was detrimental to the common folk or to the country at large. And so there was a great fear of corruption. Remember, this is one of the lessons that Americans carry out of the Revolutionary War. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So anything that concentrates power makes Americans post-revolution very nervous. Those arguments aside, Hamilton managed to ram this thing through the Congress. And so a law is passed creating a national bank for a trial period of 20 years. So we're not committing to it forever. We're saying we're going to give it 20 years, and at the end of those 20 years, we'll evaluate. Did this work, not work? Are we happy with it? Do we need to make changes? And we'll go from there. So a 20-year trial. And that bill lines up on Washington's desk, and Washington has to decide what to do. And remember that presidents do not make laws. Presidents do not pass taxes. That's what the Congress does. Presidents can propose, presidents can champion, presidents can suggest, but at the end of the day, the only power that a president really has is to sign or to veto legislation. And Washington had to make a decision, and that decision was a little bit more difficult than one might have imagined, because he had 2 brilliant men giving him completely opposite advice. And Alexander Hamilton, of course, who was the brainchild of a national bank, was urging Washington to sign the legislation, and Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State and the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, was telling him not to sign. And here we have now a dividing line, philosophical dividing line, that is beginning to appear in the country, because what Hamilton is arguing is that the United States needs to develop a complex economy, an economy of towns and cities, farms and factories. We need to economically be able to stand alone and to take care of all of our needs, and a national bank is an important tool in being able to do that. It's an important tool in being able to defend the country in wartime by making it easier to sell bonds and bring in revenues and these sorts of things. But Jefferson disagreed. He thought that the United States should remain a simple economy, primarily rural, because if a man owned his own land, he worked for himself, he was his own boss, and therefore he could make his own political decisions. Whereas if you get people people working in factories and businesses, then they work for somebody else. And the interest of the business or the factory or the firm becomes the dominant factor in their political decision making. And Jefferson believed you start to crowd people into cities and you get all the vice and the corruption that goes with cities. So better to remain rural and agricultural, get our industrial needs mostly from Europe, and therefore something like a national bank wasn't required. But there was an even more fundamental argument between Hamilton and Jefferson over the question of the national bank. And that stemmed from the issue of its constitutionality. And what Thomas Jefferson tells Washington is that he cannot sign the bill creating a national bank because to do so would violate the Constitution. It would be unconstitutional. So here you are, the Constitution is less than 5 years old, and we are already having an argument over what it means, what it says. The men who wrote it, who ratified it, who argued over it, are still there, and they're already arguing over what exactly the Constitution means. And basically, Jefferson is taking what is considered to be a strict interpretation of the Constitution or a narrow construction of the Constitution. Article 2 of the Constitution lays out the powers of the Congress. It gives it the power to make war. It gives it the power to conduct diplomacy, to regulate interstate commerce, to impose taxes and tariffs. It gives it the power to do all sorts of things, but there's a specified list of powers. And what Jefferson says is nowhere in that specified list is there a sentence that says you can create a national bank. And unless that sentence is there, you can't do it. And therefore, creating a national bank would be unconstitutional. And this is an argument for a very confined set of powers for the national government. We want to keep as tight a rein on the national government as we possibly can. Hamilton counters that not only is a national bank a good idea, it is perfectly constitutional. And he points to Section 8 of Article 2, where at the end of this long list of specified powers, things Congress can do, is a phrase or a clause that says that the Congress can make all laws that are necessary and proper to carry out its specified powers. And so Congress can make any law that it considers necessary and proper to wage war, to regulate interstate commerce, to print money, to levy taxes and tariffs. And Hamilton tells Washington a national bank is necessary and it is proper to carrying out a whole bunch of the functions the Constitution gives the Congress. And in making this argument, Hamilton has therefore brought into the spotlight one of the most expansive parts of the Constitution, and that is the necessary and proper clause, or sometimes called the elastic clause. It is the single largest grant of power to the national government in the Constitution. And you see, the Founding Fathers hoped to create a government that would last forever. And therefore, they knew that the Constitution would have to be something that would work for the future as well as for the present. And they could envision the necessity of the national government having to do things like regulate trade, collect tariffs and taxes, wage war, that sort of stuff. And they said, here's the big job that we want the national government to do. Anything that falls outside this list is the purview of the states or the people, and that's codified in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. But we know that we're not always going to be able to forecast what will be necessary and proper to wage a war, to regulate interstate commerce, and these sorts of things. And so we're telling Congress, here's the big job, and you can do whatever you need to do to get that big job done. And therefore, you're giving the Congress an enormous amount of flexibility. And this is today the justification for most of the things that the national government does. The Founding Fathers could have never envisioned the need for the United States to have a space program, to build an interstate highway system, to respond to a pandemic, to build an atomic bomb in order to win a world war, or to regulate air traffic safety, or to give loans to college students who wish to further their education. The Founding Fathers, therefore, didn't attempt to imagine a list and make it. They said, here are the big ideas, and you can do whatever's necessary to accomplish the big ideas. And of course, Hamilton is perfectly right. The Elastic Clause makes it constitutional to create a national bank, and he convinced Washington, and he signed the national bank into law. So Hamilton's fourth proposal was the creation of a protective tariff. And this was part of his concept of making the United States economically self-reliant. Heretofore, we had been primarily an agricultural country with no real industrial base. We had sent our agricultural products to Europe and brought industrial goods back in trade. But if we wanted to avoid entanglements in Europe's problems, if we didn't want to be reliant on Europe's economies and therefore sucked into its political and diplomatic issues, we needed to be able to stand alone. We need to be self-sufficient. And one of the ways that you had to do that was to develop American industry. The development of American industry, however, was going to be very difficult because it was competing against European manufacturers, and especially British manufacturers who had long ago made the investments necessary to start up their businesses, overcome the initial difficulties engaged in beginning a new enterprise. They make very good products. They can sell them for a very reasonable price, even after seeing them across the Atlantic Ocean. And in face of that competition, the American manufacturer, who's just starting, who has all those initial costs to bear, all those initial difficulties to overcome, cannot offer as good a quality or as good a price. And that means that people are going to buy those European goods. The American manufacturer is never going to get up off the ground, and America is never going to have its own industrial base. And the solution to that is a protective tariff. Now remember that a tariff is merely a tax placed on goods imported into the country. There are two kinds of tariffs. There is a revenue tariff, which is designed to raise revenue. So it's a modest tariff, say a nickel on every dollar that comes in. That nickel cost is passed along to the consumer, but if the difference at the marketplace is $1 or $1.05, that probably doesn't keep somebody from buying that good, and therefore the manufacturer can ship in lots of them because people are going to buy lots of them, and the more of them that are shipped in, of course, the more revenue the government is going to make. If 1 million $1 widgets come in and you get a nickel off of each of those widgets for the federal government, it adds up pretty quickly. A protective tariff is designed to do exactly the opposite thing, and in an extreme case, let's say it's 100% tariff. So you have a $1 widget. When it comes in, the U.S. government would charge $1 to allow it into the country. The cost of that tax is passed along to the consumer, and now that widget is $2 in a store. And if an American manufacturer can make a widget and sell it for $1.50, then he's going to win out. If he's making a $1.50 widget and trying to sell it against $1 or $1.05 widget, he's not going to win out. So the idea here is we basically keep the foreign competitor out. We give the American manufacturers time to get up, to get running, to get good at what they do, to reduce their costs, to find their niche in the marketplace, and that will level the playing field. And perhaps when you have a level playing field, you can let the foreign goods in, but until then, we need to keep them out to inspire the growth of American industry, the production of American jobs, and the creation of American self-reliance. The problem with this proposal is that it flew in the face of Southern economic realities. The thing that ran factories, that powered the machines in factories in the late 18th century was water. Water wheels turned the gears that made the machines run. And that meant that if you were going to have industry in America, you needed to have it someplace where you had lots of little streams running rapidly downhill that could run those water wheels. And you also needed to be close to large populations, so you could find workers and you could find markets. Being nice to ports for the movement of raw materials back and forth would be helpful as well. And that, of course, points toward New England. And New England was where you had large populations, ports, cities. It's where the terrain was right for factories. It's where the growing season was short, so people look for different means of economic livelihood. And so if you're going to have a protective tariff, although in a big picture it benefits the entire country, in the immediate sense, it's going to benefit New England alone. In the South, which does not have that kind of terrain, which has a long growing growing season where you don't have a lot of cities and ports. People are still mostly engaged in agriculture. They're not going to switch from that to starting up factories or becoming industrial employees. And therefore, all the South gets in the short run is a higher cost of living, whether it's higher prices for imported English goods because of the tariff, or it's higher prices because now you have to buy American goods. It's a higher cost of living. And for Southern planters, this was particularly harmful since many of them were locked in a credit system with England. Now, they had to buy on credit what they needed while they were growing the crop. When they harvested their crop and they sent it to Europe and they sold it, that money went to pay off last year's debt, which left them with no funds to buy the things they need this year, and so they have to buy on credit again. So Southerners economically did not like the protective tariff. Many of them questioned its constitutionality. It was a little harder to find a justification in necessary and proper clause to irrefutably contest that issue, and so here Hamilton lost. This time Hamilton loses. And as a consequence of that, he doesn't get the protective tariff. Although he's raised as an issue, it's not going to go away. We're going to be revisiting it over and over and over again. And in 1830-31, issues about the tariff will bring the United States very close to breaking up in potential civil war. But for the moment, it's done. So Hamilton had 4 proposals. Full funding, passed. Assumption of state debts, passed. National Bank, passed. Protective tariff, failed. Big picture, Hamilton's actions did help the economy. They did right the economic ship of state. But they did something else, and that was to divide the country, to divide the Congress, to divide the political class and the press into 2 camps, one that had favored all of Hamilton's proposals and one that had opposed all of Hamilton's proposals. Because if you liked one of them, you probably liked all of them. And if you disliked one of them, you probably disliked all of them. And so we've kind of divided ourselves into 2 political factions. And that's important because these political factions become the raw material for the creation of political parties. There were no political parties. Remember, Federalists and Anti-Federalists were not political parties. They were simply different camps fighting for or against ratification of the Constitution. Once the Constitution was ratified, Federalists and Anti-Federalists don't really exist anymore except philosophically. And the Founding Fathers said nothing about political parties in the Constitution. In fact, they rather naively hoped there would never be political parties. They didn't even use the word party. They would refer to faction. And of course, faction has a much more negative connotation than party does. But nonetheless, the reality is that you're going to get political parties. People are going to organize to push agendas, to push policies. And to do that, you have to have power. And to get power, you have to win elections, which means you have to raise money and you've got to select candidates and run campaigns and these sorts of things. So as smart as the Founding Fathers were, this was kind of unrealistically hopeful on their part. And now these debates over Hamilton's economic issues have done the dividing, created the raw material. Now you just need the spark to bring those political parties into existence. And interestingly, the spark comes not from anything that happens in the United States, but from something that happens in Europe. And specifically here, we're talking about the French Revolution, which breaks out in the middle of July of 1789. It grows out of our revolution. The French had run up a huge debt, assisting us in our struggle for independence. To help retire that debt, the King of France, Louis XVI, had to call the French legislature into session, something that had not been done for a very, very long time. The idea of higher taxes was the spark to a French Revolution that was a true revolution in the classic sense of the people on the bottom angry at the people on top, and the way that they ran things and the way that they condescended to the common people and didn't take care of the common people. And so the people on the bottom overthrowing the people on the top. And when the French deposed their king and his queen, Marie Antoinette, they would eventually chop off both of their heads. Then the French Revolution broke out in full flower. And initially this thrilled the Americans. Because we perceived the French Revolution, at least in the beginning, as an extension of our revolution. This was the birth of democracy in France, and wouldn't it make sense that this would happen in France because France had aided us in our struggle against the British, and therefore France had kind of caught the infection and carried the infection to Europe, and now the French people were following in America's path. They declared the rights of man, penning the phrase life, liberty, and fraternity. How close is that to the Declaration of Independence and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Nonetheless, the French Revolution is going to cause a great deal of problem, not just in Europe, but in America as well. And that comes from, first off, the fact that the French Revolution goes off the rails pretty quickly. It becomes the violent overthrow of an established order. You have the Reign of Terror in Paris. 5,000 people are decapitated by the guillotine because they had the wrong last name, or they had the wrong social class, they read the wrong books, they got askew with the powers that be. The French Revolution is going to come very close to provoking civil war in France, as those who supported the revolution were opposed to those who wanted to restore or maintain the monarchy. And in the face of that, the French revolutionaries did the thing that all successful revolutionaries sooner or later wind up having to do in the face of internal division, and that is to pick a fight with a hated outside enemy. And by picking a fight with a hated outside enemy, you rally the people to the government. They hate the outside enemy more than they hate the factions within their own country, and this gives your revolution time to solidify and keep going, even if it's at the cost of an external war. And of course, the greatest enemy to France is England. And so when the French revolutionaries needed a hated outside enemy, England is there. And in February of 1793, the French Republic declares, quote, the war of all peoples against all kings, unquote, and inaugurates a war with England that will eventually suck in all of Europe, that will morph into the Napoleonic Wars and will last for 21 years. And so Europe is descending now into more than 2 decades of warfare, and this is going to impact the United States very quickly, because in 1778, after our victory at Saratoga, we had signed a treaty of, quote, perpetual friendship and alliance with France. Never-ending, everlasting friendship and alliance. And now that France is at war with England, the French expect the United States to go to war with England. And that was problematic for the United States for a couple of reasons. First off, we weren't prepared for war with anybody, and George Washington knew it. Our finances are still in disarray. The country cannot raise the money to enlarge the Army, enlarge the Navy. What there is of an Army, Navy is very small. The Army is out west fighting Indians. We barely won the last war against Britain, and we're in no condition to fight another war against the British. They would invade us from Canada, they would blockade our ports, they would sweep our commerce from the ocean, and we could do very little about it. And so Washington might not like the British, but he can't afford to go to war with the British. The other difficulty, of course, is that most of America's trade is with England. 75% of all of our trade is with England. And so to go with war and to England means that we're sort of cutting off our nose despite our face. And so Washington needed to find an excuse for neutrality, and he found it. The French sent a new ambassador to America. The British have established a blockade of France, so he has to sneak in to the U.S. via Charleston, South Carolina, instead of coming to New York or Philadelphia. And the French ambassador didn't play by the rules of protocol. So as soon as he got to the United States, he began making speeches and public pronouncements, and he made it sound like, well, it was a done deal that America was going to join the war against England. And he began to issue what are called letters of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E-E, letters of marque, which are basically a license for somebody to become a privateer. And if privateer sounds a lot like pirate, it's because it's sort of similar. A privateer is someone who, as a private individual, wages war on the high seas on behalf of a government. And there have been lots of privateers during the American Revolution, for example. And a privateer was somebody who took a merchant ship, put a couple of guns on it, and sent it out to raid enemy commerce. So a privateer isn't looking to fight an enemy warship. That would be suicide. He's looking to swoop down on an unprotected merchant ship belonging to the power against which he is waging war, or against which the country that he's working on is waging war, capture it, take it to a neutral port or a friendly port, and then sell it as a prize of war. And you get half the profit as the privateer, and the government for which you're fighting gets the other half of the profit. And so it is kind of like legal piracy, and it could be very, very profitable. And a lot of Americans who didn't like England and who saw a chance to make a lot of money fighting on behalf of France snapped up these letters of marque, and they went out on the high seas and they began to attack British ships. When Washington heard of all of this, he quite rightly said that the French ambassador had no right to do any of it. He hadn't even presented his credentials to the American government to be formally recognized. And so Washington took this affront to American diplomatic dignity as the excuse to do the thing that he needed to do regardless, which was on April 22nd of 1793 to declare American neutrality. So we're not going to jump into this war on the behalf of France. And that angered the French mightily. And it did nothing to placate the British, because American privateers working for France are already attacking English ships. And as far as the English were concerned, the Americans could proclaim their neutrality. That didn't mean that England had to believe that we were actually being neutral. And so the British retaliated, not only by refusing to let American ships through their blockade of France, but also by attacking American ships trading with French islands in the Caribbean. And remember, the British will not let the U.S. trade with British islands in the Caribbean, and so that trade is very important to the U.S., and now the British are disrupting it. They took hundreds of American ships as prizes of war. And the reaction of the American people was pretty apparent, and it was pretty immediate. The flag's been fired upon. Almost literally, the flag's been fired upon, and by our hated enemy, the English, and they demanded war against Britain. And this, of course, was something that George Washington could not give them, for the reasons previously stated. But he had to placate the press and the public somehow. And so he turned to diplomacy, and he sent the Chief Justice of the United States, John Jay of New York, to London to work out a treaty to get the British to stop attacking our ships and to ease off the pressure that was producing the cause for war in America. And John Jay was someone who was a well-known hater of the British, and he was sent to London with 4 goals. He was supposed to get a treaty that would allow us to avoid war, and the 4 things he was supposed to press for were: 1, the removal of British troops from American soil. So remember, there are 1,000 British troops sitting in forts on the southern shore of the Great Lakes, and they have not been removed because America hasn't compensated loyalists for their losses in the Revolution as per the terms of the Treaty of Paris, and so the British have refused to remove those troops. Well, we want them gone. We want them gone. Secondly, we want compensation for the American ships the English have taken. And then we want an improvement in the commercial relationship between England and America. Hey, if you don't want us to trade with France, then make it easier to trade with you. We don't care where we're making the money. So open up the British islands in the Caribbean for trade by American merchants with American vessels. And then lastly, and most ambitiously, the Americans wanted Jay to get the British to recognize our definition of neutral rights, which is to say that as a neutral power, we got to ignore blockades. Our ships on the high seas should be left alone by privateers and everybody's navy, so long as we're not carrying war material, guns and ammunition and that sort of thing. We should be able to come and go as we want. And this was naively ambitious, and Washington probably understood that it was, because there was no way the British were going to accept that. To accept that would be to make their blockade meaningless. It would be to make their primary instrument of political and diplomatic and military power, their navy, useless. So Washington knew when he sends Jay across the Atlantic that Jay's not going to get all this. And he tells him that's okay. Get half of it. Get 2 of the 4, and that'll be enough. I will be able to use that to avoid a war with England. The difficulty for Jay was that Alexander Hamilton was so frightened that Jay would push too hard for all 4 things that he would wind up getting nothing, and there would be a war. And Hamilton agreed with Washington that a war with England right now would be a horrible, terrible idea. And so Hamilton stacked the deck against Jay. He let the British know that, hey, he's going to ask for 4 things, but he'll take 2. And as a consequence of that, when Jay got to London and he tried to get all 4 of his terms, the British insisted they would only give him 2, and they wouldn't back down. And so he finally gets a treaty that bears his name, Jay's Treaty, brings it back to America. It says nothing about compensation for our ships that the British had taken. It says nothing about neutral rights. It agrees to remove British troops from American soil, but hey, Britain's in a war in Europe. It can't leave those troops on American soil. It needs them over here. Of course, it's going to bring those guys home. And then it allows small American ships to trade with the British islands in the Caribbean. So that's not much. And when Jay brought that home and the terms of it were released, the American people were horrified by it, or at least a good portion of the American people were horrified by it. This looked like we were being bullied. We were being slapped in the face. This was considered a humiliation. People wrongly accused Jay of having sold the country out, having accepted British bribes. His body was burned in effigy, and he was denounced. But Washington saw in this treaty enough, and he submitted it to the Senate. And all treaties are required to be ratified by a 2/3 majority vote of the Senate, and they're supposed to happen with the advice and consent of the Senate. And here you got a tussle, one of those early constitutional tussles, because the Senate was not happy with the treaty, and it demanded to see Washington's instructions to Jay and Jay's communication with Washington. It wanted to see how this treaty came about. And Washington refused, citing executive privilege. He had the right to communicate with his personnel without worrying about their mail being read, and he had the right to get honest and frank counsel from his ambassadors and the people who worked in the executive branch, without which he could not perform his functions efficiently. And he made that stick. So we had the first presidential claim of executive privilege, and for Washington, that was the end of advice and from the Senate. He's not going to ask the Senate's help in foreign policy anymore. He constitutionally has to seek its consent, but he's not going to ask for its advice. And Washington did see the treaty ratified by a vote of 20-10, so not a vote to spare, but Jay's treaty is ratified, and Washington is therefore able to avoid a war with England. That success, however, came with the price of creating political parties, because this debate over Jay's treaty was the spark that led the 2 factions that had been assembled in response to Hamilton's economic proposals. Excuse me. It led those factions to actually organize themselves into political parties. And so if you had liked all of Hamilton's proposals, then you were in favor of Jay's treaty. And if you disliked all of Hamilton's proposals, you were probably opposed to Jay's treaty. And so the 2 groups understanding that, hey, you know what, if we want to be able to dictate what future policy is, both economic policy and domestic policy, as well as foreign policy, we need to be in charge. And to be in charge, we have to win elections. And to win elections, we've got to organize. And so you had the birth of the political parties. The Federalist Party is the party that is in power. And now the Federalist Party is different than the Federalist. Federalists wanted to ratify the Constitution. The Federalist Party is an actual political party. It is the party of Washington and Adams and Hamilton. And the Federalist Party believes in full funding, assumption, protective tariff, and the National Bank. The Federalist Party favors England in the war that's raging in Europe, not because they like England, but because it doesn't make sense to provoke England. They favor a strong central government, one that is capable of dealing with the country's problems. And this was a lesson that these men had learned during the Revolutionary War while they were in the Continental Army, that you needed a strong government to fund an army, to fund a navy, to make decisions, to get things done. The other thing that the Federalists believe in is a complex economy. They buy into Hamilton's notion that we need farms and factories, towns and cities. We need to be able to stand on our own economically in terms of manufacturing. And the thing that kept the Federalists up at night was worry of revolution. They believed in the maintenance of public order at all costs. They were a little suspicious of pure democracy because they believed that pure democracy led to mob rule, as they were seen play out in the streets of Paris during the French Revolution. Opposed to the Federalist Party are the Democratic Republicans. So the Democratic Republicans are the mirror image of the Federalists. So they favor the French in the war that's being waged in Europe. They do not like full funding. They do not like assumption. They do not like protective tariffs. They do not like a national bank. Unlike the Federalists, who believed in a broad interpretation or a broad construction of the Constitution, the Democratic Republicans believe in a narrow interpretation, a narrow construction of the Constitution, and therefore they argue for a relatively weak central government. They want the states to have a great deal more power than the Federalists do. The thing that the Federalist, the Democratic Republicans also argue is a simple economy. Let's remain primarily agricultural, because if we remain agricultural, people remain politically independent. And of course, the thing that terrified the Democratic Republicans is what they called, quote, commerce and the spirit of commercial men, unquote. They were in essence afraid of an economic elite, an economic aristocracy forming that would manipulate the central government for its own interest. And so you have two political parties diametrically opposed to each other, and one, the Federalists are in power, the Democratic Republicans are out of power, and therefore they cannot influence policy at all. And this is going to lead to mistrust, misunderstanding, fear, loathing, outright hatred between the two parties. And it doesn't help that the newspapers, of course, are not objective reporters of the news. Arguably, objective reporting of the news is impossible. There is no such thing as pure objectivity. You could and should strive for it, but deciding what to report and what to highlight and the language that you use and the sources that you go to and all that, that's all purely subjective, and it is subject to bias. The newspapers in this day and age, and in fact for the duration of our class, didn't even pretend toward objectivity. They belonged to one political side or the other, and that meant that they were either spouting the Federalist line or the Democratic Republican line, and this helped to heighten the division and the anger and the debate. And perhaps nothing illustrates this more than the so-called Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion, which takes place in western Pennsylvania. Remember, Pennsylvania was an agriculturally bountiful state. It grew a surplus of wheat and corn, more than was needed to feed people. These were not commodities that were necessarily useful for overseas trade, and the farmers of western Pennsylvania took a lot of their excess corn and they distilled it into whiskey. And that was, in fact, easier to move around in barrels than, bulk corn being hauled in wagons and this sort of stuff. And it was also a very profitable business. And you got to remember that there weren't a lot of beverages around. One of the most dangerous things people could do in that era for most of human history is take a drink of water. Because water is swimming with all kinds of organisms, and some of them, like cholera, can kill you in a nasty way and very quickly. There were occasional opportunities for things like ciders made of apples or stuff like that. But milk turned bad fairly quickly. There was no refrigeration. There were no preservatives, and so liquor was a common drink. Beers and wines and whiskey. And whiskey in America was particularly well liked, and it was also used as medicine. Remember, we didn't know anything about germs. There were no antiseptics, no antibiotics. The things that today we pop a pill for, a headache, a muscle ache, or something like that, you couldn't do that. There were no pain relievers to speak of, and so liquor was the primary pain reliever for everything from a toothache to a headache or a broken bone. And so whiskey was very profitable and much in demand, and therefore it was the logical thing for the first Congress to tax. So the first tax ever imposed by a U.S. Congress was a tax on distilled whiskey that was put in place in 1791. And since it was the very first tax and it fell on the people who were manufacturing whiskey, there was a lot of resistance to it. Wow, this wasn't fair. We're being picked on. We're being made to pay for, the operations of the government. And it doesn't help that the farmers of Western Pennsylvania lean toward the Democratic Republican side, and this is a Federalist Congress imposing this tax. And so the farmers of Western Pennsylvania simply refused to pay it. They harassed officials who tried to enforce it, and this becomes known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Something of a misnomer because it never even gets as far as Shays' Rebellion. I mean, nobody's getting the musket down, forming military units. There's no clash of arms as there had been at the Springfield Arsenal at the height of the Shays' Rebellion. It's simply a giant refusal to obey the law. And it was beyond local authorities to enforce, in part because Pennsylvania is run by Democratic Republicans. And they know what their constituents want. They don't want to enforce a law that makes the voters unhappy. And so Washington's response was aggressive. He was determined that the country would learn that the federal government was in charge, that the laws passed by Congress were duly considered, duly voted on, following the rules of the Constitution, and that they would be enforced. And if you didn't send that message now, then you were going to allow a precedent to be established where the states could basically ignore the U.S. government. And that had been the kind of thing that had got you in trouble with the Articles, and Washington was not going to let it happen again. So he proclaimed a rebellion. He called out 15,000 militia, took personal command of them, marched into Pennsylvania, rattled the saber, made sure the law was enforced, and people knew it was going to be enforced, but there was no rebellion to put down. There was nobody to fight. And after a couple of weeks, and having made his point, Washington sent the troops home. So the Whiskey Rebellion was dealt with. The precedent that Washington wanted to set was set, which was very important, but the political reaction to it was notable, especially coming from Jefferson, who by this point has resigned from Washington's cabinet, as had Hamilton. And Jefferson, who is the leader of the Democratic Republicans, mocks the response to the Whiskey Rebellion. He says, quote, "An insurrection was announced and proclaimed and armed against but could never be found," unquote. And in some sense, this would be funny if it weren't so serious, because by responding to the Whiskey Rebellion the way that Washington did, Washington has sent a message that the government is afraid of rebellion, revolution, the kind of disorders that you had seen in Shays' Rebellion. Is going to act pretty severely against them. The Democratic-Republican response to the Whiskey Rebellion shows that they are afraid that the Federalists are becoming tyrants, that they are determined to rule no matter what. They begin to question whether the Federalists would ever voluntarily relinquish power. And so the Whiskey Rebellion sort of heightens the tension. It heightens the fear of the two political parties against each other. And of course, all of this means that when the time comes for the next presidential election, George Washington is prevailed upon to stay in office. Now, he had never intended to serve 2 terms. In fact, he had hoped that he would not even have to serve a full term. He would kind of get the government going and make sure that things are running right and then step aside. But politically, things were such that he simply could not step aside, because everybody says, you're the glue that's holding this together. The trust and the love the American people have for you is the glue that's holding all of this together. So Washington had agreed to a second term, But when 1796 loomed and it was going to be time for another election, people once again prevailed on Washington to stay, but this time he refused. The country is going to have to learn to handle its business without him. And so he announces in early 1796 that he is not going to stand for a second term. He issues his farewell address to the American people, in which he warns them against two things: foreign entanglements, like our Treaty of Alliance with the French, and political parties. And of course, the political party business it's too late. That horse has left the barn. In terms of foreign entanglements, as soon as we can get out of that alliance with the French, we're going to take him by his word. And in fact, the United States will not have a formal alliance with another country until the aftermath of World War II. We will fight as allies with other countries in the world wars, but a formal alliance by treaty isn't going to show up until the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, at the onset of the Cold War. So Washington is going to exit the stage. He's not got much longer to live. He's going to die in December of 1799, basically from strep throat. And so he's not going to be with us for very much longer, but he is no longer president. He has once again voluntarily relinquished power when he did not have to, when he could have held on to it for as long as he wanted. The American people would have kept electing him. At this point in history, there is no limitation on the number of terms a man could get. You could run as long as you wanted to run, and you could serve as long as the people want to elect you. That will not change until the aftermath of World War II and the 22nd Amendment, which follows Franklin Delano Roosevelt winning 4 terms as President of the United States in a row. And even his party, the Democrats, believed that that was extreme, that nobody should be able to be president for a quarter of a century. Washington had once again proven how critical he was. He had been the right man to be the first president of the United States. He had given the office true stature, dignity, power. He had established a lot of important precedents. He had guided the country through some very problematic times. He had set the tone going forward. The question now is, can that tone be continued, and can the country survive the existence of political parties and the continuing war in Europe? And so that brings us to the end of the first part of lecture number 2. And so time for some questions. And so here are the questions that you need to answer and email back to me within the next week. And the first of those questions is, who was George Washington's vice president? First question, who was George Washington's vice president? Second question is, what is Alexander Hamilton's proposal to make sure that the United States government pay its bills, and all of its bills? What is that called? The third question is, who was the Supreme Court justice who was sent to London to create a treaty that would allow Washington to avoid a war between the United States and England? And the next question is, what event in Europe sparked a war between France and England? What event in Europe sparked a war between France and England? And then the last and final question is, who was the leader of the Democratic Republican Party? Who was the leader of the Democratic Republican Party? So answer those questions and email your answers to me. This is the objective portion of your test. That's what these are going to add up to. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of our second lecture. And part 2 will cover the administration of John Adams from the election of 1796 through the Quasi-War.